Hey there, everyone. I want to welcome you all here and also congratulate you on picking the most interesting panel of the entire Milken Institute Global Conference. Because if you think about the theme for this panel, and with my deference, of course, to my friend Dennis Neal, who's got his own panel, sorry, but anyway, the theme of this conference is the future of humankind. And if you think about what we're talking about here, we're talking about tech versus talk. It is something that we all can relate to. It does not matter what walk of life you're in or why you've come here, whether you are an investor, you're in finance, you're in healthcare, you're in education, you're in family studies, whatever it is relevant. And you're not here to listen to me. I'm going to help moderate this panel, but I am going to introduce everybody because we have a pretty stellar group. First of all, I'm Alex Witt. I'm an anchor with MSNBC. I have my show, Weekends with Alex Witt, and I also do a show called Way Too Early, which is way too early in the morning, preceding Morning Joe, thus the name. Anyway, and then to the far right here, this is Dr. Genevieve Bell. She is the VP of Corporate Strategy and Senior Fellow at Intel Corporation. I have Linda Burch here just to my right. She is the co-founder and Chief Education Officer of Common Sense Media. You will come to understand exactly what that means when she explains a lot of things. Sherry Turkle, who's known to many of you. She's a professor at MIT, the author of Alone Together, and most recently, Reclaiming Conversation, which has been met with rave reviews. And then Sam Yagan, who may be responsible for some relationships in your lives, as he is the vice chairman of Match Group. He is the CEO of Match.com, the founder of OkCupid. Show your shirt. Just share it. There it is. Okay, little advertisement of OkCupid. He's also on the board of Tinder, and Match Group also owns Tinder. So we're going to get into all of this and talk about, first of all, with Sherry. I'm going to have you start the conversation because what are the things that just bother you the most when you go to bed at night, when you think about where tech versus talk has gone and where it's going? What are the things that you think, no, this needs to be righted?
Well, I've been very struck by a few landmark studies that have sort of motivated me to try to make the point that conversation, face-to-face conversation, I call it the talking cure. It's kind of, we need to bring more of it back. And one study is very simple, and actually it includes a tip, a kind of takeaway, which is that if you're having lunch with a friend and you have a phone turned off, face down on the table, two things will happen to the conversation during lunch. The conversation will turn to more trivial things, and the kind of empathic connection between the two people will be less. And so many of us just naturally go to lunch with friends and business acquaintances who do that. And so that's the kind of thing where I feel a little bit more knowledge about really what the research shows about how subliminally that phone reminds us that we can be always elsewhere.
Can I just ask
would
quickly,
make a big help.
Raise your hand if you've ever gone to dinner or lunch and had your phone on the table.
Oh,
Okay.
yes, come on.
Raise your hand if you've ever taken a phone call or said, hey, hang on a second, I need to just text someone back or answer an email. Raise your hand if that's happened while you're in the presence of others. Raise your hand if you've ever sat somewhere, as I have recently and was horrified, watching a whole group of people at a table, which is a communal event, not even speaking to each other. I mean, they're looking down, maybe ordering their food, and that's about it. I mean, have you ever seen that happen? Okay, so does that bother you? Just an affirmative, a yes or a no? Okay, right. But you've probably done it.
Yeah, so here's just to give you a little support, a recent study showed that 89% of Americans say that they interrupted their last conversation by taking out a phone. And 82, to look up something, it wasn't like part of a large devious plan to hurt anybody's feelings. And 82%, that wasn't part of anybody's large devious plan. And 82% say that by taking out that phone, it deteriorated the conversation. So my feeling is that we know we're doing something that kind of isn't in our best interest, and that we are ready to change our behavior and really make our phones work a little bit better for us.
But how does that relate to children who, I don't know about you guys, I've got kids and they became technologically savvy way before they're still better than I am at it. And it starts at a young age, and you see young kids, 2, 3 years old, and they are mastering these little devices in their hands. So talk about that, the pros and the cons.
Well, I think what is so amazing is if you really think about how rapidly the aging down of technology has happened. Common Sense is only 12 years old, and when you think back to 2003, there was no Facebook, there was no YouTube, there was no Instagram, there was no Hulu. Google wasn't yet a verb. And so now we see these 2-year-olds swiping. And I think that is something that really puts pause into any parent's heart when they see it happen. On the one hand, we're so excited about the learning potential that might be there and all the positive things. But in our guts, we are saying, okay, what is this doing to our kids' brains? What kind of child is going to develop out of this? Really and truly, how are we going to navigate this world with a child who begins to use technology and respond at age 2 to 4? We did a study in 2011 of kids ages 0 to 8 and found that 10% of kids under 2 had used a mobile device. These were interviews with parents. 2 years later, in 2013, we did the study again. The number had jumped to 38%. Next year, we do it again. And so I think that this kind of concept of being with technology from the time you're very small to the time you're old and what it does to the nature of your relationships is really the big question parents are asking today. 10 years ago, it used to be, I'm concerned about predators. A few years later, it was, I'm concerned about cyberbullies. Now it is really, the question that we get all the time at Common Sense is, please tell me, what is this technology doing to the nature of my kids' relationships, to the structure of our family, to our lives in general? So I think it's emerged as a really important question for all of us.
I'm curious, Genevieve, and she's got a very cool job. She, with Intel, has overseen a bunch of social scientists that have gone around the world. They've looked at different cultures, different entities within homes, cars. I mean, you really have looked and looked at where technology plays in these different places. Talk about that. Are we the worst in the United States in terms of consumption and volume of consumption?
It's always good to be asked that
I don't know
question.
worst,
as
but,
a foreigner. Are you bad?
Yeah, Aussie, yeah.
Yes and no. So a couple of things that I think are really interesting, right, is that when we talk about technology, we use this kind of totalizing language. Everyone uses it, everyone has it, all children. And the reality is we know that's not true. There are different kinds of access based on class, geography, where you live. There's all kinds of ways where not everyone is engaging with technologies in the same ways. There's also the forces of culture and cultural practice. And I know, because Sherry and I were just talking about this before, we also talk about this as though it has always been thus. And the reality is most of these new technologies in mass adoption is comparatively new. It's a decade. I'm willing to bet many of you in the room are early adopters, and it feels like it is a lot longer than that. But the reality is it simply isn't. And most human cultures take a really long time to sort out how they want to think about things. And Linda's spelling out the arc. First we go, danger, panic. And then we go, we don't know how we feel about this. And then we go, we should probably think about how we want to feel about it and start working out the rules. Social rules, not just the sort of the regulatory ones. And the reality is it looks really different in different places. We did some field work a long time ago now in Italy, which was one of the first markets where mobile telephony overtook fixed landlines. Pretty hard to get a landline in Italy, really easy to get a mobile phone. People had lots of mobile phones. Most people had more than one. There was the phone that you called your mother on because it had a long battery life and a cheap call plan, and there was the phone that you went out with. So that doesn't change. And there was the phone you went out with the rest of the time. And one of the things we discovered when we started to talk to teenagers, who are often an interesting proxy and not where the world is going, was that if you were the coolest kid in school, you never took your phone out. Your phone was in your backpack, turned off, and the only time you ever took it out was to call your mother and say you were coming home and what was for dinner. And the reason was if you were cool, you didn't need a phone because everyone found you. And there was this whole kind of notion that coolness and phones had no correlation. And I'm not suggesting that's where we will end up here, but what it does suggest to me, because I know that would make Sam unhappy, but what it does...
I'm the only one who didn't bring my phone to this room.
I know.
That's true. I was shocked.
Well, you've already swiped left and right, mate. I think you're good. So I think And I don't mean that as an insult, as a compliment.
No, it's all good.
But I think there is a piece where there will be lots of different ways that the technology settles in our worlds. And what is the moment of 2016 won't necessarily be what it is in 2017 and 2018. If you were a cool kid in Milan in 2008, you put your phone in your backpack. If you were a teenage girl in Milan in the same time period, you gave your phone to your best friend and she took yours. Now pause and think about that for a minute. Yeah, exactly. And there was a kind of a notion that phone numbers, phones, and personal identity weren't all constantly correlated. And I think what it says to me as a social scientist is that there are lots of different ways this will unfold. There is no one right way, there is no fixed way, and that it always takes time for human beings in families, communities, countries, cultures to decide what they want it to be, and it constantly evolves. And 10 years in, I'm not surprised this is the conversation we're having.
It's appropriately what we're having, talking about and analyzing it. And we're going to get to what the future holds for all this in a minute. But to Sam now, and to Match. So Sam, a lot of people will say, Match.com, man, it's bringing people together, but it's not the same way that you would meet people and converse, and it's a completely different way to do things. But you're saying that you're not changing behavior with Match.com. You are just making it more accessible. You're augmenting it, right? Kinda?
Kind of. I also want to react to that, but I'll swipe left and right thing. But let's get to that in a second. Here's if you fundamentally think about what online dating products do, is we facilitate introductions, right? 99.999% of the relationship that you have over the course of your time is all done after you've long left, whether it's Tinder or Match or OkCupid. And so I think the idea that we're changing fundamentally how humans actually date, I think, is totally overblown, because all the dating happens after you're off our product anyway. I also just want to, I think there's a little bit of just hysteria, undeserved hysteria about all of this. I mean, technology enters our lives, and then we all freak out, and we say, oh my gosh, what is it doing? And then it's all okay. I mean, when I was in college, if you did, the on-campus recruiting office required you to write a handwritten letter after you went to an interview. Why? Because it was impersonal to send an email follow-up. It was inappropriate. It was too informal. Could you imagine that now? It's crazy. But at the time, people felt very strongly that it would be so rude and that you didn't take the time to write a piece of paper and put it in the mail.
Can I just say something, though? I've taught my kids to handwrite like thank you notes, and every time I get one or they have put one out there, people acknowledge it with a very welcome response. They say, wow. And people, I got a handwritten note from you, like, that's fantastic.
Great, and there are absolutely times to do that. I'm just saying that it's not like the email follow-up has not destroyed our society.
And Alex, I mean, Sam's exactly right, and I'm glad you called me on it, because truthfully, where I usually locate myself is that every new technology is accompanied by a very predictable form of anxiety and hysteria. You know, and if you look at the last 100 years, you know, electricity was predicted to be the demise of the American family. Bad for women, electricity particularly bad for women, because the lights would be on and people would know we were home. Like, imagine that for a minute. Railway trains, cars, television in particular. And it's not to suggest that we shouldn't have critical conversations. I think we absolutely should. But there is a place where you also have to ask, what is the anxiety actually about?
I think there's an interesting analogy here with books. People are always saying to me, you know, what about books? And I think that the point I'm trying to get across is that we need to start to make up the social mores that will make our life with phones make more sense to us. Mm-hmm. Because if I said to you now, let's say we're having lunch, and if I said to you now, just hold on, I have Madame Bovary with me. I just want to spend like really no more than 2 minutes on that chapter where Emma and Rudolph are in the cab. They're having like sex in the cab. I love that.
I'd actually do that with you, but
yeah,
okay.
Hold the thought. Hold the thought. I'll get back to you. And you just sort of sit there like, you know, a paused tape recorder. You're holding the thought. Well, I'd do that. You know, we somehow decided with the book that we were not going to use the book that way, that we would read the book in private, or we would read the book consensually with other people at certain times, but we weren't going to be putting each other on pause in each other's presence by kind of unilateral decision. And I think that these are the kinds of rules, mores, sensible decisions that we are now making with our phones. And I myself feel that it's very natural that it's taken us a little bit of time to go through smitten, oh my God, look what this phone can do. I mean, it's amazing, to saying, you know, this phone is interfering with aspects of my relationship with my family, with my children, with myself. I'd like to kind of get this right.
Well, look, there's a concern about isolationism when you get into your phones. I mean, with the exception of you know, what Sam is providing to society. But I look at, for example, when I travel on Metro North to get to NBC, right? I'm on a train. Everybody's reading in their own place. You get on the train, hey, how are you? Sit down, boom, you go into your own world because you're reading your newspaper or your device or a book or whatever. How is that different than, why is it that we have an ideal towards the technology as having a little bit of a negative undercurrent to some degree, as opposed to reading a book or a newspaper or even watching TV by yourself?
Well, I'll tell you why. Is that I make a very big point about solitude and the capacity for solitude and the capacity for boredom as being one of the great developmental achievements of childhood, first of all, but then something you really need to bring forward to the rest of your life. And I don't want to, you know, take up too much time with that, but let's just take the capacity for solitude, is that you need to be able to, and I think this is why mindfulness has become so important in our culture, you need to be able to gather yourself to yourself so that when you're in conversation with someone else, you can hear what they have to say and listen to them and not just project onto them who you need them to be. Now, our phones are constantly stimulating us. Research shows that if you ask college students to just sit alone with their devices, they say, okay, I'll do that. And then you say, well, do you think you'll want to electroshock yourself while you do that? And they say, no, that's ridiculous. But after 6 minutes sitting alone, you sit them alone with kind of a handy electroshock machine next to them, and after 6 minutes they are self-administering electroshocks rather than just quietly sit alone with their devices. So we are so used to the constant stimulation of always having the phone to go to, of constantly having stimulation, that we are losing this capacity for solitude, and with it self-reflection, self-containment. And I think that this is an issue that needs to be, thought about, particularly when you have baby bouncers being with a slot for the iPad, potty trainers with a slot for the iPad, products where really children should be looking at a parent, talking with a parent, or having practice in that all-important capacity for solitude. So I am concerned.
Yep.
I also think there is a difference between technology and a newspaper or a book. It's the interactivity component of it. And what I hear kids and parents talking about is the need to be instantaneously responsive to the technology at hand. And I think that really is what has changed in the past 5 to 10 years, 5 years even. When I look at my 2 kids who are 4.5 years apart, there is a certain kind of expectation, and it is a norm that nobody agreed to, but has become part of the way that we behave, that if you get a text, if you're a young person, that you must text back. Because there is somebody at the other end of that text waiting for a response. And what do teens care about more than anything else? Relationships and friends. And so what has happened is this sense of needing to always be on, always respond, even when the phone is in the pocket. You know that someone might have texted you. There might be an experience you're missing out on. There might be someone who's kind of upset that you're not responding right away. And what I'm finding very interesting is that what is changing in the nature of parent discussion around this is that behavior is now coming into the family, and we are all feeling that pressure, whether we're at work or at home, to really be always on and always responsive. And I think that interactivity piece is really different than a moral issue around a moral panic around the television, for example. We were all sitting around it. It's that back and forth element and how it really is in the middle of our human relationships that's somewhat different.
And are you seeing, Genevieve, the fact, I mean, are we becoming, oh, Sam, did you want to comment? Go ahead, go.
I'm just going to say, like, again, not to be the contrarian on this panel all the time, but I feel like we're talking about teens a lot. Mm-hmm. Can I tell you, when I was a teenager, I would call my best friend.
Yep.
We would turn on Beverly Hills 90210, and we would sit there with the phone to
Yeah.
our ear. Mm-hmm. And we would watch, and then in the commercial, we'd be like, oh my God, you see what? And I don't do that now because I'm an adult and I have like a life and things to do. So like, we could have been on this panel before and said, oh my God, teens are watching 90210 with their phones on their ear. And that just is this phase. And like,
and it misses.
oh my God, all the things I did as a teenager that I don't do anymore. Like, is that really what we're talking about?
But to both of you, though, are we becoming more impatient?
But,
I mean,
there's a
professional-
second piece of this, right? And I think you're exactly right. You know, if you think about notions of time that are layered through this, right? Teenagers, for the most part, in some countries, again, I hasten to add, because in lots of places teenagers are already working, so notions of time and disposable time look really different, right? But there are different affordances of time. What is fascinating is the same pressure to be available is a pressure that clearly came through the global financial crisis for many blue-collar and white-collar workers, both in the US and elsewhere. Sure. There was a notion that if you weren't responding to your boss, you were not doing your job. Mm-hmm. So the notion of a kind of relationship between technology and a crisis of time is manifested through lots of generations, right?
Yeah,
and that there is a...
Yeah, I want to comment on this because one of the big changes in the focus of my field work over the past 5-6 years has been really going into companies, going into and studying what's happening in companies and not just in schools and among teenagers. And there's no question that you have companies that officially say, I'm pro-conversation. This is a conversational company. This company is about talking. It's about communication. And yet, the devotion to the company really is measured by whether or not you are always on your mail, whether you will respond always by being on your mail. And I work in and many companies, and here, I mean, I would have to say that I work in one of them, hold meetings where the meeting takes place with everybody on their mail elsewhere while we're having the meeting, because the time doesn't feel even that we can take time to be together, not also being elsewhere. So intense is the pressure to be other places. So I'm just saying that I think to address this problem, I think it's very important. I was very struck by your comment about we're talking about kids. My research shows that we are teaching, that I like to say parents and grown-ups have not stepped up to this as mentors. We have stepped back because in a way we have become more smitten, and we need to give a good think about what our values are.
You have it in your book. You talk about a father who's got, I think, a 14-year-old and a 2 or 3-year-old.
Yes.
And the 14-year-old, had her father by her side getting baths and the like, and the 2-year-old's got him on the side of the bathtub texting and
Exactly.
reading her emails while she's splashing about.
Right, and he says, and he says to me, when the older daughter was young, the conversations we had were the basis of our relationship, and now with the 2-year-old, I'm texting while I'm doing my email when she's in the bathtub, and basically I use this as one of my cases to talk about people are ready to reevaluate how they want to use this technology.
Something that I want to get a conversation between the two of you with regard to empathy, lack thereof, or the promotion of it, because one of your big things is that you feel that technology is making society void of empathy. I mean, it's drawing it down. And yet, I look at something like Match.com, and as we were talking beforehand, Match has actually allowed so much more diversity. I mean, Sam, he was hysterical. He goes, yeah, I used to just marry or hook up with the person who was in the cornfield with you, right? Now, via Match, the diversification of whom you are exposed to. And in my mind, I think empathy comes with knowledge and understanding and compassion of other people in different situations. So you guys can argue about that. It doesn't technology, or have at it.
I think this is like a great essay question. Here's the question: just compare and contrast, discuss. I think first of all, before we have what's going to be a fascinating conversation. This is going to be great. There needs to be a distinction between compassion and empathy. It's just a little technical response, because this comes up a lot in discussions of virtual reality, where, put on those goggles, you're in an immigration camp in Jordan of Syrian refugees. Are you feeling more empathic with those refugees? No, I think you're feeling compassion, you're getting a sense of what their situation is. But the kind of empathy that's being measured, and I brought in my little note of studies to mention that, there are studies of empathy that shows that among college students, it has decreased by all the ways we know how to measure it. Empathy is where I can really feel by, what your state of mind is. And that is somewhat different. Traditionally you get that by talking to you, by apologizing to you. Is the best way to get empathy is to practice apologizing. Like my grandmother would say, don't do it if you're not contrite enough, because it won't work. In an apology, I have to see whether you've sort of softened enough for it to work, and then you have to see whether I really mean it. And then this little dance goes forth. That's the kind of process where people can read other people. If you put on those virtual reality glasses and you get a chance to have compassion for people in their other states of mind, that's a somewhat different thing. That's knowledge of other people, that's compassion for other people, but I'm really making a distinction between that and the specific social skill of being able to have an empathic conversation. So I think that I am so pro, I'm so pro technology
and bringing people together.
Together, and then once they get together, they develop empathy because they're talking.
Oh, I guess you don't have to talk now, Sam.
I'll just be texting. Or swiping, I guess.
Swiping.
I'll lend you my phone.
But it's not I think it's a kind of false, I think it's very important that we not set up kind of false dichotomies, but it's not, I don't think it's from reading a lot of profiles that they're going to develop. In my view, it's not from reading a lot of profiles of people of the world that they're developing the specific social, psychological skill of empathic communication.
Sam?
But you may feel differently.
No, I think I will. You obviously have expertise in the differences between empathy and compassion, and I don't want to use the wrong term, but what I will say is, back to the point we were making. I grew up in rural Illinois. Literally, it was a cornfield, and virtually everyone I know from my junior high is married to someone else from my junior high, and it was a pretty homogenous group, mostly white, mostly Christian, mostly middle income. It was like and you end up with families and kids who all look like that. And I think when you look at the kinds of relationships that happen on any of the online dating platforms, you don't know what side of the tracks the person's on when you're sending that message. And so much of dating and relationships happens around your friends. And so, if you're at a social event with, three of your good friends, and all of a sudden you're talking to someone who looks or thinks or acts differently from what the norms are, then that's a pressure that you have because you have to comply with the expectations people have of you. The messaging that you're doing on your phone with someone who looks different, has a different educational background, that can all be done in private. You can get to know that person before you introduce them to your friends. So I just think the progressiveness of the relationships that come out of these digital platforms is so powerful and so transformative to the world. Does that result in compassion or empathy? I don't know. That's not my area of expertise, but I can tell you that 1 in 3 marriages starts online, and I can tell you that those marriages and those relationships end up being far more diverse than those that don't. And I think that's good for the world.
And let's not undercall the fact that an entire category of devices has made possible forms of identification and relationship that would have been really hard. You grew up in rural Illinois. If you were a gay kid there, how do you know who your friends were? How did you ever find anyone you could talk to? And you have multiple studies, Mary Gray's work from Microsoft Research, looking at what teenage kids in the South have used mobile devices and the internet for in terms of creating new forms of solidarities, new forms of socialness, of actually having a place, virtual and all, but a place where who they were was not only okay but celebrated. There's this piece where it's a false dichotomy to say there is tech and talk, right? What there is in fact is a portfolio of technologies that will get used and embedded in cultures in different ways. And for as much as we can talk about some of the challenges, I think it's really important to remember that it's also facilitated the emergence of voices we would never have heard and have never have mainstreamed otherwise. I grew up not in rural Illinois, but on an Indigenous community in Australia. And the Aboriginal people that I grew up with use all this technology to bring their stories and their language both forward to the current generation, but into circulation in a way that they simply couldn't have done before. And I think there's that piece about saying, yeah, there are tremendous areas where we have work to do, but there are also places where we just should have a tiny moment of being really hopeful.
Yeah, totally agree. I remember that video that went round where people were dancing in different countries all across the world, and it went around. And when I think about the aperture widening so greatly through technology and what kids have access to and what families have access to, I really believe at the end of the day that is going to be a huge contributor to a different kind of cultural understanding. It sounds simple and trite, but I believe it's true. And I think that the ways that kids are using technology to express their creativity is unbelievable. That's a place where I get very excited with young people making mashups.
Not just young people.
And older people. It's my lens right now.
Lots of people.
But I look to that because I think if they can figure out ways to tell stories that they have witnessed through the internet in wide sense. They tell their own story, they tell others' stories, they mash up stories. That's got to be good in the end. And so I totally agree with you. I think one of the problems with technology is we often try to think about it as either monolithically good or bad, and it's not. It's a tool. It's a tool to relationships, it's a tool to learning, it's a tool to collaboration. It's a tool, but in that sense, I tend to agree with Sherry that we should make it a tool that serves us in the way we want to either raise our families, connect with others, and being reflective about that and thoughtful about that is not denying that the technology is great either. It's a navigate your path to a better life for everyone with this technology as part of it.
The way I see it is that we start to learn, instead of thinking about our addiction to technology, which I think is so unhelpful, you start to learn about our vulnerabilities to promises that this technology makes that can get us in trouble. And like one of the promises is, is kind of creating this always on life when actually or this promise of perfection, like my students don't want to see me in person. They want to send texts. They want to email me.
You mean like office hours?
Office hours.
Yeah.
They don't want to come to office hours. They want to email me a perfect message, and I should email them a perfect message back. And I try to explain to them that really the people who get lit up by learning, it happens not because you send something perfect, and I think here the profile and the working on the profile and it has gotten them into a state of mind where somehow they can be perfect. It happens because you show something imperfect, and your professor says, "This isn't so good, but come back. We have a relationship. I'll see you next week." So I think where we get into trouble is when technology encourages us to take a relationship and turn it into a transaction. And that's the kind of thing, on this point that it's going to take a little time, where you have to live with this technology for a while and realize that we're kind of vulnerable to it taking, and I think this goes for business so much, that it takes relationships that do better. I mean, it takes things that would be better as relationships and turns them into transactions. We have to recognize those and bring them back into the relational area.
See, I actually take a different angle on that. I mean, when I was CEO of Match, I think people would, if somebody was going to present something to me live, it would have gone through 86 layers of review and PowerPoints and this, that. And by the time something came to me in a meeting, it was like sanitized of all risk and creativity. Number of people, and the culture I tried to build at Match was, hey, if you see me walking in the hall, you have an idea, just grab me. If you don't see me walking in the hall and have an idea, just email me. And I think quite the opposite. I think like a text is not like perfected, and I think like that frequency of interaction you can have. And then think about video. And we seem to be really focused on mobile, but think about all the conversations that video enables in terms of that face-to-face and nuance and understanding. We ran a global business where we were having daily face-to-face conversations that never could have taken place before video. So I think we should talk a little bit about sort of how some technologies like video really transform for the clearly positive, I think, the ability for people to have those kinds of relationships.
Piece about teasing out a series of conversations I think we're all, and I'm as guilty of this as everyone, conflating, right? So there are a constellation of technologies that we're talking about. There are also quite clearly a constellation of cultures and practices, and there are affordances of the technology, right? How it is physically built that drives certain kinds of relationships. I mean, it is certainly the case that most mobile devices, all the ones out there, function best when they have power, connectivity, and a network. And, as human beings, we function better when we don't have all those things all the time. So you already have this really interesting tension between the technical affordance of the object and the cultural physical affordances of us as human beings. So there's this weird kind of conflict there that I think it's taken us a little while to resolve. You also have a whole series of cultural practices that we layer on top of the technology, whether it is the logic of late capitalism, my academic roots right there, whether it is, ideologies of business, notions about risk and failure, notions about innovation. And we talk about the technology in some ways. We had this conversation earlier too about whether the technology has agency or not. And if it doesn't, what it does have and what we wrap around it. And I think teasing those things apart get to some of your challenges of how do we, and Sherry's too, right, of how do we both imagine and enable a set of conversations about what we want to be with these objects, is a conversation about what do we want our cultural practices to be, what are the logics of the institutions we work in, and what are the affordances of the technologies and, by the way, the business models that make those technologies possible, where there are different interventions you might want to stage at any one of those places. And there's that piece about pulling them apart just a little.
And to that point, given this audience, I mean, the monetizing of all of these devices. I know that you have been a proponent of certainly acknowledging that, and Silicon Valley is going to be all about all of that, but you've also suggested that it would be great if technology could develop something that we could put onto our phones that would actually encourage people to stay off them for a period of time, to shut down for a bit. But how would that work, financially speaking?
Well, I think there are a couple of things. I think one of the dramatic things in the empathy research is that for kids is that 5 days at a device-free camp, and so you have that study that shows that I'm not sure I mentioned that fully, is that in the past 30 years, all the ways that we know how to measure empathy among college students has decreased by 40%. And the person who was the head researcher on this study, Sarah Conrath, was so depressed by this finding that she began to write empathy apps for the iPhone, thinking that technology got us into this problem, and they blamed it on technology in that research because most of that decline took place in the past 10 years. So she began to write empathy apps for the iPhone. In a conversation with her, I said, well, what about if we're the empathy app? What about if face-to-face conversation is the cheapest and the best empathy app? It's not something you do on your phone to get you more empathic, but just getting people together is the empathy app. And there's a wonderful set of studies out of UCLA that show that if you send kids to 5 days at a sleepaway camp where there are no devices, just having them talk to each other starts to get those numbers back up. In other words, there's nothing magical. I mean, this is sort of a human capacity that we're not getting enough of. So you could say as a human value, to get to your point, we know we're having something of a problem in this empathy area. We know that we're resilient. That's the good news. We'd like designers to give us some help because we have a vulnerability to our phones, and if they're always on, if they're always on you, if they're always kind of like a kind of slot machine, Google is describing, people at Google have described the design of the phones as a kind of slot machine that's always trying to kind of get you on them. If you design them a little bit less like a slot machine, can you help us use them when we need to use them, and then have them go silent when you don't need to use them? What about if that was our design, the design criteria for phones? Like, for example, phones that would not text in cars, that recognized you were in a car and said, I'm not doing it. As the first obvious thing, I'm not doing it, and the only text that would come through to you would be an emergency text that said, pull over, you need to make an emergency call. Now, what would be the objection? I'm trying to take the simplest possible, speak now or forever hold your peace about what's wrong with that.
What if you're a passenger?
Well, actually, one of my proposals is that the car should be a sacred space for conversation.
Okay, but that's different from only getting a text if you need to be, if it's an
Right.
emergency text.
I was at a meeting the other day where a parent admitted that they can't resist texting when driving, and so what they end up doing is putting their cell phone in the trunk. They've got Bluetooth, they can still get on to talk, and there is technology now where the texting, there's kind of text to read kind of technology that may happen. But I think what's interesting is those are brute force kinds of solutions that we are coming up with to kind of handle what we know is a hard thing to do. So
But I
why
think
not?
that-
So why
yeah,
not
but I
think
mean,
about it in
and,
terms of technology?
if you want to override it because you're a passenger, but I think the onus should be that in a car. I actually think that a car should be a place.
That's like saying a restaurant should
be a place for
not
conversation.
serve you food because you might eat too much.
No.
It is.
No, it's saying that restaurants.
No, I don't understand
No,
the
it's not.
logic. It's
The
like
logic is
humans. We need to be able to take care of ourselves. And if it's dumb to text while you're driving, don't text while you're. You should. I don't know. It's like people get in their cars when they're drunk. But should everyone be required to take a breathalyzer before they walk into their car?
I'm not sure that. I think that in areas because when you're drunk, you put me and my children.
Of course.
At
So isn't that
danger.
way more important than dealing with whether I'm going to have an emergency text to pull over?
Yes, because texting for me, in terms of the people who are being killed, is similar to drunk driving in terms of how many people are being killed and kill other people.
Right.
Now I think that having a phone.
I'm just saying we've had drunk driving for as long as we've had cars, and
Yeah, and I
we
think-
haven't managed to do that. So I just
Well,
don't
I
think we're
think
going
we should move
to have
ahead on- I think
a
we
car
should-
that doesn't, a phone that doesn't operate when it's
I'm
moving.
good. I'm good on moving ahead on both these fronts.
Or perhaps maybe we
I'm
need.
good on. I'm good. I'm good on saying. I'm good on. I think that technology makes us confront our human values. Every technology, not just digital technology, which is a good thing because I think you get to see how strongly we are committed to these human values. And I think that given the kinds of death rates from texting, we really have an opportunity here to think about what do we want to do about it.
And this is to Genevieve's point, that we are having these conversations. Texting and driving has become topic du jour in so many places and times, a couple years in now.
Yeah, but we're also at a moment where we can start to think about smart systems at a different level. But as soon as we do, it raises a whole series of other questions, right? Which are questions not just about safety and efficacy, but about morality, about notions of what is appropriate behavior, which not everyone is going to consent and agree to, right? So,
but also questions about interference.
Yes, and about what that looks like,
about
right?
Interference. But I was the most fascinating conversation. I wrote down the name of the program. I'm forgetting the name now, but there's a program that basically it's part of the Internet of Things, and you put it on your phone, and it works a little bit like the Marauders map at Hogwarts and Harry Potter,
So
where
cool.
You get to tell the barista at your Starbucks, what kind of mochaccino, cappuccino, you want, and you set out on your road and you see who your friends are on the way, and you can program it to avoid seeing ex-husbands or ex-spouses, ex-partners, or ex-business partners, ex-anybody with whom you might have had conflict.
Well, because what's coming, which is in some ways both interesting and I think puts a much heightened sense on all of this, is that we're moving, and Sam knows this better than I do, we're moving from a world where it was all about devices to a world where it's about devices and data. Yeah. And the data starts to let you imagine a world that is both more proactive and more preventative. So, it was very common in Seoul, and still is as far as I know, to have churches that have cell site dampeners on the basis that if you're in church, you should be in church. And the message in the lobby of every church I ever visited in Seoul said, turn off your phone and listen for the call of God. And then underneath of it, there was a little tiny asterisk that said, and we have a cell site dampener. And there was something fascinating about a notion here that you can well imagine, if you start to have smart anticipatory spaces, that what you will have, possibly not in American culture, but in cultures where there are collective ideas, that institutions may choose to determine what the value is. Does your phone work inside this building? Does this building know who is in it and determine what the throughput rate of data is going to be? Does this building know who's in it and decide, oh, we have more women than men in this room, so we're going to make this room a little warmer than it would be otherwise. Or we have more laptops than less, so we're going to lower the temperature a little bit. You can start to imagine that a number of things that have bedeviled us as human beings, where we have had to put work into the technology, some of that gets offloaded, and it becomes interesting to imagine a couple of things when that happens. Okay. Whose values win?
Yeah, but I think it's interesting that who decided that a conflict-free walk where you never have to face, I think this is interesting in terms of this notion of friction-free is so, I just live it, I work at MIT, so every day, friction-free this, friction-free that, everything's supposed to get more friction-free. This is like such a good thing. And I'm thinking, I'm trained as a psychoanalyst, so everything's supposed to be frictional. So I may be like have the other side, like really like I could be like too much and really hard to get along with person. So, but who says that avoiding everybody?
But nobody uses that app.
What?
Nobody uses that app that you just talked about.
Yet.
Well, I'm just saying the demonstration was dramatic. I'm just saying that it was out there as a. I haven't studied its adoption. I was at a demo listening to the hype and the reaction from techies, like, thank God, a sort of friction-free world. That was what I was responding to.
What I think is interesting,
and it's the values of whether people will.
But you asked who says this. People make products all the time. Forget technology. People make products all the time that nobody uses. So
you think it'll sort out? It's going to sort out.
Think about all the crazy inventions that have been made, and it's not like who had the right to make that invention. It's that nobody wanted it. Like, either people are going to adopt it, in which case it's adopted, and then we have to deal with it, or no one's going to. Like, the question of whose values decide what is offered to people to choose from, I don't understand the basis of that question.
But I think a lot of things have been offered that show that people are very vulnerable to the siren call of friction-free, of
certainly some frictions. Like, for example,
turning down conversation.
I think I have more conversations today going. If you think about the people I'm texting with, if you think of the people I'm connected with through social media, I am pretty convinced I am personally in more conversations now than I was 20 years ago. So is that more friction? Is that less friction? It makes it easier for me to stay in touch with all my friends from junior high, from high school. Like, I don't.
But Sam, these
the
conversations.
The fact that I don't want to see my ex-girlfriend every day, I don't think does that make me a bad person?
But these conversations that you're in, they're probably great conversations, technologically speaking. But if you put people face to face, do you find that people are becoming more awkward, less comfortable? They want to put forward the perfection of a manicured text and email and perfected.
I've read thousands of messages that are exchanged on dating platforms, and I can tell you they are not perfectly manicured. and no, they're not. People are themselves. And then they go out on dates, and I've been at restaurants at bars when I can tell the table next to me is an OkCupid date or a Tinder date or whatever, and they're having a normal conversation.
Okay, can I just ask a question? Hang on, and this is. Okay, the concept of OkCupid versus Match versus Tinder.
Sure.
Give me the genesis of what these are supposed to do specifically and how they differ.
Yeah, so there's a lot of debate on why there are so many different. Well, there are 5. Why there are 5 big dating apps in the U.S. Certainly, age is the easiest way to think about it. So Tinder is the youngest, and then OkCupid is the next youngest, and then Match is the oldest of those 3. And you could think of it as a continuum. But I think really the way to think about it is the search for. This isn't like you're just searching for an iPhone 6S or whatever, and you just go to a search engine and it pops you out a bunch of iPhone 6Ss. If you say, hey, I'm looking for a male in Los Angeles who's 35 to 45, there's 25,000 of them. And so in some ways that search hasn't really solved your problem. So if you think about a block that might have 4 bars on it, right? Those 4 bars all serve essentially the same alcohol, same product being served, but each one is going to have its own different feel and vibe and clientele. So the way I think about why we as Match have so many dating products is because the brand serves as a really strong filter, right? People have whatever belief they have about OkCupid and about Match. Some people think, oh, Match is for my mom, and Tinder is for this, and OkCupid is for geeks, and whatever. And if that's what you're drawn to, then it sort of self-perpetuates. And so that's why I really think each brand sort of has its own filter that draws into a certain audience into it. And
okay, so can I just ask about Tinder? Because you guys are all probably know where I'm going here. It has the rep as being a hookup app. That's it. I mean, literally sex. And it came to my attention during the Sochi Olympics because it was all over the place. I mean, we broadcast the Olympics at NBC, and we were hearing, I think before it hit the mainstream media, about all the Olympic athletes, let's get on Tinder, and there were all these hookups. And I was like, really? I thought that was just so fascinating. I mean, is this what Tinder is intended to do? And it's okay if it is. We're not like passing judgment, has it evolved into that? And are you comfortable with that?
I don't have the exact data on this, but I would bet you that Tinder is responsible for more relationships right now than virtually anything else out there. I mean, just look.
Because of the age demographic?
Here's the reality of it. The reality of it is that no matter if you're the purest, whatever, you're going to hook up with somebody if you're in a relationship with them. That's just part of the process of having a romantic relationship. And so I think, first of all, like this idea that some apps are for hookups and some apps aren't, I think is totally just creating a false distinction. I think the reality is that what happens on Tinder is it's so easy. The point of Tinder is for you to get on a date as fast as possible, right? So like if you think about the traditional dating products, OkCupid, Match, and the like, there's this vetting process. So you invest a lot of time up front in back and forth. Is this someone I want to go on a date with? And then you have a date. Tinder takes a different point of view, which is spend less time up front trying to figure out over a bunch of messages back and forth whether or not the date's going to be good, and just go have that first date. And so by virtue of just generating a lot of first dates, they have lots more activity. And so, look, it's not at all that there's like hookup apps and not hookup apps. At least not among Tinder and the apps that Match operates.
Okay. Linda, go ahead.
All of which suggests, not unsurprisingly, right, that as technologies appear in our lives, they will manifest themselves differently. It's not going to be one solution. There is not a single dating app. The same way there isn't a single, it turns out, almost anything other app. There are multiple variants on things because human beings are not all the same.
And I think to your point, like, look at the Olympics 4 years before Sochi. Do you think the athletes were hooking up?
Yeah.
I'm just saying, it's not like they had never thought about having sex with the bobsled team, and then they're just like, wait, Tinder, now I will. That's not how it works.
What dorm are you in? Great, I'm coming to your floor.
There were stories of like how many, whatever.
But it is reasonable to ask because I think it's, where Sam started this conversation is, why is it that that particular thing is a flashpoint about technology? What does it say, not about Tinder and all of the dating app sites, but what does it say about us that that is a place where our anxieties are being played out? So what is it about the notion that technology that initially seemed to be a thing of geeks and of productivity and of certain kinds of technology, as it advances further and further into the parts of our lives that become increasingly touchy, whether it's our romantic lives, I would say our religious ones. Sherry and I were talking about what does it mean to have a class of religious robots appearing? What does it mean to think about all the quantified self-activity, so anything that's tracking our bodies? What does it mean as apps get closer and closer to us as human beings, and the technology does all manner of the technology, is that a set of anxieties get mobilized that are telling, right? But they're not necessarily telling you anything about OkCupid. They're telling you all about us.
I think they're telling us about what do we define
As
that
being
makes
human.
us feel specifically human.
Yeah.
So, for example, there's a new technology. Apparently, it's sold out before I was able to get my hands on it. So I was told this morning it was sold out. Virtual reality a whole class of virtual reality technologies that are designed purely for sexual relationships. Virtual reality technologies that now simulate sexual relationships where you actually feel you have a partner there, and and
Kind of like Her,
What?
the movie.
Well, but actually, Her, it was really just talking. It was in your head. She wanted to have a surrogate, but he was happy to just be talking.
Yeah, but she had like 48 going at the same time, didn't she?
Well,
but
right.
Anyway,
What her pointed out was this fantasy that we have that when we develop the perfect artificial intelligence, that artificial intelligence will be interested in us. And Her was a very brilliant movie because I think it pointed out when we develop an artificial intelligence that can pass this test for our thinking that it is erotically interested in us, that is going to be that is going to be a piece of technology that has other interests than us altogether. And that's what that technology showed. But I mean, the point I'm making is that the anxiety about this technology, the anxiety about these technologies that first go to sex, pornography, is I think it's because we get nervous about them because these are areas that make us feel that these are the kinds of things that are about our humanity. And I think that's why you get so much flack and so much, you're sort of on the forefront of anxiety, is because, oh my God, it's about dating, and is it your fault that there's the hookup culture? And I think actually it isn't. And I think actually as someone who works in colleges, lives in colleges, is close to the college scene, I think that the forces that were moving college life toward a very different attitude and a very different kind of perspective on what kind of sexual relationships would happen and at what pace and with what kind of commitment had not this guy did not not him. Not me. We seem to have, I think we have some theoretical epistemological differences, but not laying this on him. I mean, people were looking for a variety of different things, but they weren't particularly meeting on they were in a dining room and go, hey, you want to go have a drink?
It could be that the anxiety, because I think what you said about who gets to decide if it's data or if it's anything else, the anxiety surfaces when the technology moves quickly and something becomes a norm before you've had a chance to reflect and weigh in. And who do you reflect and weigh in with? And that's why when we think about it in the context of families, that is a first place to start. I can tell you this, a story of just 3 weeks ago, and I am one of the co-founders of Common Sense. It was a Sunday afternoon. My son we were all sitting on our laptops, quietly doing work, Sunday afternoon before Monday. And my 17-year-old son walked into the room, and we were on the first floor in our communal public spaces. And he said, I have to talk to you guys. And he sat us down and he said, this has to change. I do not feel like this house is a refuge anymore for me. There is absolutely no line between work and play, between home and school. And we've never talked about this. It's just happened. And, you know, there I was in the role that I'm in, and we sat down and we talked about it. And he said, look, I feel anxiety, I feel oppression, I feel like there is never a moment when I'm really with myself, when I can really relax, when there isn't some sense that I should be someplace else or there's someone trying to speak to me. And it was the act of having that conversation and defining the norms that put the control back into the hands of that 17-year-old who, frankly, I agree with you, Sherry, you say the youth are going to lead us into this. They're sensing it now, and some of their disappointments are forcing us to face up to it. So we ended up with 3 rules that were quite remarkable. One of them was no technology in these public spaces on the first floor. Second one was if you're going to be on a phone with somebody about work, you have to be behind a closed door. And the last one, which was mine, which is really important, and was the person walks in the room. If you're on that technology, you don't just look up. You actually pick it up and put it aside so that you can have that conversation. So I think as long as we, in our families, in our communities, in our nation, are having the conversations about what are the new norms that we're willing to embrace, I call them bright lines. You know, when I see something emerging in the relationship with technology in my kids, texting to each other in the house was one. I call it a bright line. Then we stop and we talk about it and we say, okay, what do we want to be?
But okay, but you can have this conversation with your 17-year-old son because he's able to carry on this conversation. What about the young children that you're talking about that you've researched with Common Sense Media, and the 3 points you say that you see that are disturbing: attention, addiction, and distraction? I mean, are the parents then the gatekeepers? Is it up to the parents? And what happens to these young kids who will develop with technology around them in every manner imaginable?
Well, I think the parents have to be parents, and there's nothing wrong with setting norms and limits.
But there's that parent who's sitting by the side of the bath, you know, texting and emailing while his little one's splashing.
They need to be brought into the conversation. I think that Sherry's ideas of sacred spaces are really important. This is happening, these discussions are happening in schools across the country. We need to set rules, we need to set lines, we need to have kids understand why. And then we have to be great role models. We have to walk the walk and talk the talk.
So here's the deal. I've been given a wrap, so I just want to ask each person to go down the aisle here and tell me quickly, hope and fear for the future of technology relative to your perspective. You can do hope or fear, so we don't have that much time.
My hope that there is this opportunity as we move from a moment where it's been us with devices to us with devices plus data, where for me the constant question is what makes us human, and how do we ensure that what makes us human is what drives the design of the next generation of things. But that means we have to be brave and persistent and ask hard questions and learn things about stuff we don't always know and not fall for the easy trap of saying it's tech or us.
All right, Genevieve, thanks. Linda?
My hope is that together we kind of embrace all the positive potential of learning that comes from this. I think there's a ton of self-learning that comes with technology, and that we find ways to have these conversations.
Okay, Sherry?
My greatest fear is that we step aside from the, I would say, the new hot thing, which is to talk to apps that seem to understand us, that want to be our friends, that want to be our therapists, that put themselves as our companions, particularly for the elderly and for children. Whether it's Hello Barbie or Jibo or all the apps, or Paro, which I worked with for so many years, apps that say, I can be your best friend, I can be your therapist, cheaper, better, faster, always there.
Okay.
Very seductive, and don't do it. Just say no. Because I should have told you.
I fear that for sure. My hope is that technology continues to bring people together, both strangers and people that you already know, in ways that make it, that allow human relationships to thrive in ways that they never have before. And I think that's what technology has done over the last millennium and will continue to do.
All right, that's a wrap. Thanks, everyone.